Should Baraggan have been the Primera Espada instead of Starrk? It's a Bleach question as old as time, pardon the pun, and to be honest, I've never been wholly convinced one way or the other. And now with the more recent revelations regarding the Espada ranking system, the waters have only been muddied further. Back in the day, during the Fake Karakura Town Arc, readers were desperate to know which of the top 3 Espada was going to be number 1. And to be fair, I was personally always rooting for Starrk. The Primera Espada really meant something back then. It was a near mythical position that came with a lot of pressure and fan anticipation. Since then, however, numerous twists and reveals have only served to undermine the position somewhat. From Yami's reveal as the Zero Espada to modern-day discussions on what the Espada rankings really mean. For example, if the ranks of the Espada are no longer based on lethality, then what weight does the Primera really hold anymore? But it was a different story nearly 15 years ago. While most were happy with Starrk claiming the top spot superficially, ultimately at the time I just thought that Starrk was the cooler character, questions began to rage as the battles played out before us as to whether or not the second Espada, Baraggan Louisenbahn, actually deserved it more. From his abilities to his place in the narrative, and later on, by looking at what we would come to learn about the Espada rankings, did Baraggan deserve to be the Primera Espada in place of Starrk? How different would that swap look today as opposed to the Bleach we knew 15 years ago? What kind of an impact would it have, and would it even work anymore? Would it make sense? Does it make less sense now that the meaning behind the Espada rankings has been transformed? Let's take a look then at one of Bleach's oldest debates. However, before we get started, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't done already to stay up to date with all of my videos. It really does help support the channel. So, after months of waiting, it was finally revealed in chapter 339 that yes, Starrk was in fact the Primera, meaning Baraggan was Espada number 2, while Haribel was ranked 3rd. During the time of the Fake Karakura Town Arc, this meant that Starrk had earned the coveted title of the most lethal of the Espada, the greatest killers of them all. And yet there was always something peculiar about this decision. Everything about Baraggan seemed to indicate that he should have been the Primera, from his overall kingly demeanour to his incredible time-based abilities, the significance of which were only reinforced by his own reveal and explanation of the aspects of death, which we discussed in the last video on the channel. If Baraggan's aspect of death is time, aging, then he really does embody the ultimate, most universal, inescapable form of death there is, something else that you would think would therefore place him at the pinnacle, the apex, of the Espada. Narratively and thematically, Kubo seemed to have built Baraggan up to be the top dog, and this only became more apparent as time went on. It's later revealed that he is the literal king of Waco Mundo, the ancient god-emperor of an entire race of beings in Bleach. His very hollow mask fragment is a proud crown. He commands a fleet of Fraction that live and die by his command, and his resurrection takes on the form of a human skeleton, dressed in a shadowy regal garb, with an even more prominent, now glittering golden crown adorning his head. Virtually no other hollow looks like this. More so than almost every other Arrancar, Baraggan is the most human-looking of the bunch once his true power has been released. The closest in form to him is in fact Starrk himself. Upon activating Los Lobos, Starrk also takes on a fully humanoid form, save for a hollow mask eye patch, which you would think would therefore make him less humanoid than Baraggan, but I don't know, I'd argue that Starrk having flesh is a one-up over Baraggan's skeletal appearance. Either way, they both essentially resemble total humanoids. Harabel, who is the third Espada, is also essentially fully humanoid, save for the fact that her hollow mask remnants can still be found all over her body in the form of her shark tooth style armor. And then of course there's Baraggan's abilities. I've already mentioned how his time dilation powers in base form stem from the ultimate form of death, but this is only exacerbated massively in Baraggan's Resurrection. As Baraggan himself notes on multiple occasions, his power of Respirar is an absolute one that simply can't be overcome no matter what. Baraggan's breath of death rots everything it comes into contact with down to the bone, destroying both flesh and man-made material in a matter of seconds. It's easily one of the most powerful, most terrifying abilities in Bleach, and fitting for the King of Hollows. Even Kido spells, which could potentially last for thousands of years, fall before Baraggan's overwhelming power. There's nothing else quite like it in Bleach. And certainly back when we believed the Espada rankings denoted the most powerful and dangerous of Aizen's Arrancar, it was an ability befitting the Primera, or at least what we believed the Primera to stand for. There was an idea as well that Aizen purposefully made Baraggan the second Espada to spite him. Baraggan was more than worthy of being the Primera, but Aizen gave him the rank of 2 to insult the former king after deposing him, and to keep him in line, forever reminding him of his failure after losing Hueco Mundo. Baraggan, of course, despises Aizen and wants him dead, and so this idea had a fair bit of credence behind it. There's one thing to remember though as well when it comes to Baraggan. While his power is certainly on display for all to see, he's also an unreliable narrator. He clearly has a huge chip on his shoulder and a massive attitude problem, so while his powers are obviously incredible, his ranting and raving about being the God Emperor of Hueco Mundo reeks of the desperation of glory days long gone by. Of course, the biggest roadblock to this idea back in the day was none other than Starrk himself, the actual Primera Espada. When the Espada rankings were as simple as lethality alone, Aizen was making a big statement, putting someone above Baraggan, a character with an absolute power like Respirar. And yet, if Aizen was truly serious in placing Starrk above Baraggan and wasn't doing it just to insult the former king of Hueco Mundo, then to question that ranking was to question Aizen's knowledge of his own Espada, which he painstakingly put together over many years. Not too long ago, I put together a video detailing why I felt that Starrk was considerably more powerful than a lot of people give him credit for. He more than deserves his spot as the Primera Espada, at least as far as them being ranked by lethality went anyway. Sure, Baraggan's Respirar seems purpose-built to kill things, but Starrk has him beat in almost every other metric. For starters, Baraggan is clearly afflicted by the madness that affects most Hollows, while Starrk is the total opposite. He is composed, he is extremely clever and perceptive, he is impossibly fast, and most importantly has perhaps the most immense Reryoku of any Hollow, being so naturally powerful as to simply kill those around him before splitting himself in two, creating two distinct living autonomous entities in Starrk and Lilinet. But Stark's seemingly endless well of power didn't stop there. The Primera Espada is so monstrous that he can split his soul over and over again, creating a miniature army of offshoots of himself. And Starrk is open about how his power works. The wolves that he can conjure are literally Starrk and Lilinet too. It's an understatement to say that we've never seen anything like this. Honestly, the closest parallels would be something akin to Kenpachi manifesting Yachiru or Gremmy creating life. That's the caliber of company that Starrk is with. And Starrk is seemingly able to create as many of these wolves as he likes, without end. This is, in my opinion, probably one of the most underrated and therefore overlooked abilities in all of Bleach. But of course, it's possible that all of this means absolutely nothing if Starrk can't hit Baraggan. Baraggan is surrounded at all times by a field of Respirar that he's constantly propelling away from himself out of fear for his own life. This means that were Starrk to try and reach Baraggan, well, he'd have to contend with that. Starrk himself, upon contact, would ultimately rot away and die just like everybody else, but I've never been certain how Stark's powers, specifically, would fare. Presumably, Stark's wolves would also die on contact, and yet when they are struck by Love and Rose's Shikai, they disperse and reform like flames. If they are more ethereal in nature, perhaps Respirar wouldn't affect them. Truthfully though, I don't think that's the case. From the moment Starrk splits his soul to create them, they are essentially living, and therefore can presumably die. The question in the end is whether or not they can age. And then of course there is Stark's preferred method of fighting, Sero. Sero is just a concentrated blast of spiritual energy. Can that age? If not, then Starrk has a surefire way of reaching Baraggan even through his Respirar shield. The thing is though, these days the discussion is a lot more nuanced than simply whether one character can kill the other. The meaning behind the Espada rankings has changed so much in recent years to the point where it completely alters how you look at some of those old theories. Once the idea that the rankings were based on lethality was thrown out, it was instead replaced with the idea that the Espada were being ranked by how much Reiatsu they had, which was kind of used to explain why Yami of all characters could in fact be the Zero Espada. The idea was that he bulked up over time and stored Reiatsu in a way that no other character could. Though I'm still not entirely sure how much anyone has ever really bought into that. Instead, let's return to the aspects of death discussion from our last video, kind of turning this into a follow-up of sorts. Most recently, it was revealed by Kubo that Espada of the same rank share the same aspect, which essentially means the aspect is what is tied to the rank, thereby limiting movement through the places. We know that Neutro was promoted from the 8th Espada to the 5th, meaning his aspect of death changed, which is already weird enough when you consider how Baraggan describes the aspects in chapter 356, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it's something like, our thoughts, our abilities, the very reason for our existence. But on the flip side, it's not hard to see how Neutra as a character could have once embodied madness before later embodying despair in the end. But going back to Baraggan, he doesn't seem likely to ever embody loneliness, the aspect of the Primera Espada. So does this mean the position of the Primera was always out of Baraggan's reach? If time is the aspect of the second Espada, then could Baraggan have ever really been anything else? Or was time decided for the second Espada because Baraggan was the first Espada to hold that position? It's definitely an odd one. The fact the aspects of death are seemingly the reason behind the Espada rankings implies that no, Aizen didn't give Baraggan that position just to spite him. Moreover, Baraggan had to have that placement, unless again, of course, Baraggan was the first one to hold it. The revelation that the aspect of death is essentially locked to the specific ranking really threw a spanner in the works, because it effectively means that Espada are given the number they have simply because they are the right fit for the aspect of death. As we see with Neutra, some movement is possible, but it's rare. Aranero, for example, is unlikely to ever move from the 9th spot because the 9th Espada embodies greed, which is perfect for him. Zomari isn't ever going to be the 2nd Espada, not because he's too weak, but simply because he doesn't embody time in any shape or form. So, while I made the case earlier that Kubo seemingly built Baraggan up as the true holder of the Primera Espada from a narrative and thematic perspective, the truth now is that that simply can't be the case. But also, there is one other thing to consider. If the rankings aren't based on any kind of hierarchy or tier list, it removes all competition from the proceedings. If the Primera no longer denotes the most lethal Espada or the one with the most Reiatsu, or just the Espada that is better than the rest by any estimation, then it doesn't really mean anything. It's not worth striving for or worrying over or feeling like you've been passed over. It just simply means loneliness and nothing else. Baraggan isn't the 2nd Espada because he's the 2nd strongest, but because he represents time, and that's it. That being said, I still feel like if the numbers equate to anything at all regarding the aspects themselves, and one is still considered the apex on this scale, then time should be number 1, purely from the perspective that it is the ultimate, most all-encompassing form of death, the one that comes for everyone in the end. I know there's the play on the idea of 1 being the loneliest number, the lone wolf and all that, but still. It's actually kind of fascinating as we circle back round now to the start of the video. The question of whether or not Baraggan should have been the Primera Espada has taken on a completely different meaning to what it used to mean over a decade ago. The answer is a resounding maybe. It kind of depends on the era. During the Fake Karakura Town Arc, as it was releasing weekly, a good argument could easily be made for Baraggan actually being worthy of the top spot. So much within the narrative seems to point to it, despite Starrk's own incredible, often underrated power. And yet, in today's world, knowing what we do now, the answer is a simple no. Baraggan can't be the Primera Espada unless something fundamentally changes about who he is. Originally, we believed the ranking was based on lethality, and the aspects of death were just an additional ripple that each member of the Espada carried with them. So Neutra would represent despair even as the 8th Espada. However, those days are long gone, and now it's hard to see how Baraggan could ever be anything other than the 2nd Espada. Alright guys, but that's it for the video. As always, I really do hope you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Did Baraggan deserve to be the Primera Espada, or more aptly, should he have been the Primera Espada based on what we've seen? And how do the more recent revelations surrounding the aspects of death affect this? Does it give us a totally different answer, a totally different landscape to what was originally happening 15 or so years ago? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below. Plus, just for fun, who would win in a fight, Baraggan or Starrk? Alright everyone, but that about does it for the video. As always, I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you took something of value away from it as well. And I apologise as well for the relative lack of uploads over the last week or so. I've been kind of busy, but now we're ready to get back on track once again. As always, I want to end the video by saying a massive thank you and giving a huge shout out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon, without whom I really couldn't do this, and I appreciate each and every one of you so very much. If you too love what I do here over on YouTube and you want to support me that extra step further, then thank you very much indeed. You can find a link to my Patreon down in the description below. By supporting me at the $1 a month tier, you can get your name in the credits of every single video just like this. And if you want to support me at the $2 or higher tier, you can get every single video I release absolutely free of baked-in YouTube ads. Alright guys, but until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.